In this video, we're going to talk about carbon. Carbon is arguably one of the most important elements to living organisms. So it's incredibly important that we talk about carbon and some of the elements that interact with carbon that help for living things to be able to exist. So first, let's take a look at an atom of carbon. So carbon is an element. And an atom of carbon is basically the smallest unit of carbon that you can have. If you were to look on the periodic table, carbon has an atomic number of 6 and an atomic mass number of 12. And these numbers give us some important information about what is happening with an atom of carbon. So first of all, the atomic number tells us that carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons. And remember that protons are the positively charged subatomic particle, and electrons are the negatively charged subatomic particle. And we get both of these numbers from that atomic number. So technically that 6 tells us that there are the 6 protons, and then we can kind of figure out that carbon also has 6 electrons because carbon is a neutral atom. So you have to have the same number of negatively charged electrons as positively charged protons in order to get a neutral atom. Now this number also, or if we look at these two numbers together, we can take the atomic mass number of 12 and subtract the atomic number of 6 and get the answer of 6 neutrons. So an atom of carbon has 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. Remember that neutrons are the neutral subatomic particle, so they do not have a positive or negative charge associated with them. So if we were to take a look at a model of an atom of carbon, we would start by putting the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus of the atom. And I did some color coding here just to help us kind of visualize or keep track where these different subatomic particles are. So here I'm just putting the 6 protons and the 6 neutrons, and I'm just going to put a little dotted line to represent the nucleus of an atom. Now, the electrons are going to go into these orbitals or these electron shells that kind of orbit or surround the nucleus. So first we'll draw the first orbital. And the first orbital can only hold a maximum of 2 electrons. So I'm just going to put 2 dots here. And each of these dots is representing an electron. But we've only placed 2 electrons, so we have 4 more electrons that need somewhere to go. So we can add a second orbital. We can put those 4 electrons, those 4 remaining electrons, in the second orbital. So now we've got a total of 6 electrons in our 2 electron orbitals. Now recall that the outermost electron shell is known as the valence shell. Now, the first electron shell can only hold a maximum of 2 electrons, but the second shell, third shell, fourth shell, etc., can hold a maximum of 8 electrons. Now, you'll notice that carbon only has 4 electrons in the valence shell. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So our valence shell is not full. We can actually take the 8 maximum electrons that could be in this shell, we can subtract the 4 electrons that are currently there and get this number 4. And this number 4 basically tells us that we have space for 4 more electrons in the valence shell of this carbon atom. And this also tells us the number of covalent bonds that an atom of carbon can make in a stable formation. Now, this ability to form 4 stable covalent bonds really gives carbon a lot of flexibility with regards to what other atoms it can form bonds with, and we can end up with a wide variety of different molecules and compounds that can be made using carbon as one of the primary elements in these molecules. You will learn more about chemical bonds and how they're formed, and especially carbon's role in those chemical bonds in more detail in a different video. But now we're going to look a little bit less specifically at the bonds that are forming and look a little bit more at these different carbon-based compounds that can exist and essentially make up the basis of living organisms. So first, let's talk about hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons are just molecules that contain hydrogen and carbon. So the name tells you what it is, right? A hydrocarbon has hydrogen and carbon. And the simplest hydrocarbon would be methane. And methane has a molecular formula of CH4. And it just consists of a carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms. Now, hydrocarbons can get really complex and diverse in their shape and structure and size. So methane's relatively small. It's made of only 5 atoms, but we can also get these kind of long chains of carbon that are also connected to hydrogens. There can be double bonds between the carbons. There can be triple bonds. Sometimes the carbons form a ring-like structure with hydrogen sticking off of it, etc., etc. So these hydrocarbons are very versatile molecules. They can take all these different shapes, and they can be really, really big or pretty small. They can be these kind of round circles. They can have double bonds. They can have triple bonds. They can be straight. They can be kinked. There's just a lot of different varieties or variations of hydrocarbons that exist. Now, you've probably heard the term organic before, and organic is one of those words that can have a lot of different definitions depending on the context. But when we're talking about chemistry and we're talking about organic compounds, we're talking about any molecule that contains carbon and hydrogen. So by definition, organic compounds contain carbon and hydrogen. Now, organic compounds might also contain other atoms of other elements, but they have to have carbon and hydrogen at minimum. So they may also have things like oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, etc. And that doesn't matter. That doesn't make it not organic as long as it has that carbon and hydrogen. And this is kind of an important definition to remember. And as long as you understand this definition, you can apply it without having to memorize whether every single different compound is organic or not. So let's do some examples. So let's look at that methane. So methane is CH4. CH4 has carbon and it has hydrogen, so it is organic. We could look at another molecule. We can look at glucose. Sorry, this one over here was methane. Glucose, the molecular formula is C6H12O6. It contains carbon and hydrogen, therefore it is organic. Now, it also has oxygen in it, but that oxygen doesn't matter. All we care about is that carbon and hydrogen are present, therefore it is an organic compound. Now we can look at some other compounds. Let's take a look at water. So water, the molecular formula is H2O. It contains hydrogen, but there's no carbon. Therefore, water is not organic. Some other common examples would be things like carbon dioxide, CO2. Carbon dioxide has carbon in it, but it does not have hydrogen, therefore it is not organic. And remember that organic can have a lot of different definitions, and sometimes you would think, some people think organic means good, whereas not organic means bad, but that's not the case. Here, this is just a classification of molecules in chemistry. So it's not that methane is good and carbon dioxide is bad, it's just that methane is organic, whereas carbon dioxide is inorganic. And that's another term I should throw in here. So these molecules that are not organic, we say that they are inorganic. And one more example I kind of want to throw at you is, let's take a look at something like oxygen gas. So oxygen gas is O2. We obviously need oxygen gas to survive, so this is a very beneficial molecule for us to have access to, but it does not have carbon or hydrogen, so it is definitely inorganic. Another example would be sodium chloride, NaCl. This is table salt. So this is the salt that you probably have in a salt shaker in your kitchen. And it doesn't have carbon or hydrogen. It has sodium and chloride. And so it is also inorganic. It's not organic. Now we can look at the molecular formula of a compound, but that doesn't always tell you the whole story of what's going on with the shape or structure of that compound. So let's take a look at these things called isomers. So an isomer or isomers occur when you've got molecules that have the same molecular formula, but the atoms in that molecule are arranged in a slightly different way. So we can kind of define this as molecules with the same molecular formula, but different 3D shapes. And this is because the atoms of the molecules might be arranged in a slightly different way. So first, let's take a look at a type of isomer known as a structural isomer. So the definition of a structural isomer is that these are molecules that differ in the placement of their covalent bonds. So let's take a look at an example of a structural isomer. So we have butane and isobutane. And both of these have the molecular formula of C4H10. So both of these have 4 carbon atoms bonded to 10 hydrogen atoms. But the way these atoms are bonded together are different. So in butane, the carbons are lined up kind of in a straight line. And then the hydrogens are bonded to the carbons. like such. In isobutane, the carbons are arranged a little bit differently. You've got these kind of like 3 central or core carbons, and then the 4th carbon is actually branching off to the side. And as we learn more about biology and living organisms, we're going to learn that shape matters. So the different shapes of these molecules, even though they have the same number of carbon atoms and the same number of hydrogen atoms, they have different functions to them. So for example, butane is used as a fuel in cigarette lighters and torches, whereas isobutane is used as a refrigerant and a propellant in spray cans. Geometric isomers are kind of similar in that the molecules have the same molecular formula, but once again, the arrangement of the atoms is different. And geometric isomers are more likely to occur in molecules that have double or triple bonds between their carbons. So let's take a look at the difference between cis-2-butene and trans-2-butene. And both of these molecules have the molecular formula of C4H8. However, cis-2-butene looks like this. There are 2 carbons that are doubly bonded together. And the rest of the molecule looks like this. Now in trans-2-butene, you've got those same centrally double bonded carbons. However, these other carbons are found oriented kind of opposite of each other across that central double bonded carbon. And so cis in this case just means same because the CH3 groups here are on the same side of that double bond, so they're both kind of on the bottom in this case, whereas trans means different or opposite. And that's because these carbon and hydrogen groups are on opposite sides of the double bonded carbon. And just like with structural isomers, with geometric isomers, the shape changes, and that shape matters. So it changes the function of the compound. We'll apply this concept again when we talk about lipids, especially triglycerides, and we'll talk about, you've maybe heard of trans fatty acids or trans fats. And this kind of has to do with this concept of these double bonds and in what direction the other atoms in the molecule are arranged around those double bonds.